It was a busy evening at the upscale restaurant. The soft hum of conversation filled the air, with the clink of glasses and the gentle rustling of waiters moving swiftly between tables. The restaurant was known for its elegant decor and high-end clientele. The waiters, dressed sharply in black, were busy taking orders, delivering food, and making sure everything ran smoothly. The dim lights and the low murmur of diners created a cozy, sophisticated atmosphere. A woman walked into the restaurant, her presence immediately noticeable. She had an air of confidence about her, her outfit sharp and stylish, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Her calm and composed demeanor was the kind of presence that made people look twice. Her confident steps echoed slightly as she moved through the restaurant, heading towards the host's stand. The hostess, a young woman with a welcoming smile, greeted the woman with a polite, "Good evening, ma'am. Do you have a reservation?" The woman smiled back and nodded. "Yes, I do," she replied, her voice steady and polite, but also carrying a certain authority. The hostess checked the reservation list quickly and then gestured for the woman to follow her. As they moved through the dining room, the woman took in her surroundings. The restaurant was full, with most tables occupied by couples enjoying quiet meals or business people talking about deals. It seemed like the type of place where people came to enjoy an evening of relaxation, away from the noise of everyday life. The hostess led the woman to a table near the back of the room, away from the bustle of the kitchen and servers. But as the woman sat down and looked at the menu, something seemed off. It wasn't the food or the environment. Instead, she noticed the staff subtly glancing her way, whispering among themselves. It wasn't immediately clear why, but there was an underlying sense that she didn't fit in. Maybe it was the way she was dressed, or maybe it was because she was alone. Whatever the reason, the energy in the room shifted, and she felt it. Soon, the restaurant manager, a man in his late 30s with a slightly tense face, noticed the woman sitting by herself. The woman wasn't an ordinary customer. Something about her made the manager feel uneasy. Maybe it was her composed, confident manner, or the fact that she looked different from the usual guests. The manager tried to push the thought out of his mind. Still, as he glanced over her table again, his curiosity got the best of him. He watched her for a moment, saw her quietly scanning the menu, and then noticed her making an attempt to catch the eye of a waiter. Her hand was raised just enough to signal for service, but the manager was already walking over. As he reached her table, the woman greeted him with a polite, but firm, "Good evening." The manager nodded, his eyes scanning her briefly before speaking. "Is everything okay here, ma'am?" he asked, his voice calm but a little too formal, like someone trying to control a situation that didn't need controlling. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, her voice steady, not showing any signs of unease. She wasn't sure what was going on, but she could feel the subtle tension in the air. She asked for a specific dish, one she had enjoyed at the restaurant before. The manager seemed to hesitate, looking over at the waiter. "Unfortunately, that dish is out for the evening," he said, his tone a little clipped, as if the woman had requested something unreasonable. The woman smiled politely but raised an eyebrow slightly, sensing that something was off with his attitude. "Oh, that's unfortunate," she said. "Could I have the special then?" Her request was simple, but it felt as though the manager was growing increasingly annoyed for reasons she couldn't quite understand. The woman, who had been nothing but polite and patient, now started to notice the manager's uncomfortable body language. He kept glancing toward the other staff, as if seeking reassurance. Little did she know, his discomfort was about to lead to a decision that neither of them could have predicted. The tension in the air was starting to grow. The woman noticed the manager's eyes darting toward the other staff, his brow furrowed as if he were trying to figure out what to do next. She was still calm, not giving away any sign of discomfort. She simply waited, hoping the interaction would continue in a polite and professional manner. But it didn't. The manager hesitated for a moment, then looked back at her. "I'm afraid the special isn't available either," he said, his voice now carrying a hint of frustration, though he was trying to keep it under control. Perhaps you'd like to choose something else from the menu." The woman, unfazed by the sudden change in tone, smiled again. "I see," she said softly, glancing down at the menu. She hadn't expected the situation to take this turn, but she could sense that the manager was starting to become a little more than just a little uncomfortable. It wasn't her fault that the dish she wanted was unavailable. The staff should have known better. There was a long pause. The manager was now standing awkwardly by her table, glancing around the room as if seeking guidance from the other employees. They weren't doing anything to help him, though. They were simply going about their work, their faces blank. He could feel his own growing frustration, but he couldn't quite put a finger on what was bothering him. Why had this simple situation become so difficult? The woman felt the shift in the room. She could tell that something wasn't right. She looked up from the menu and smiled politely at him again. "I'll have the steak," she said calmly. "And could you please make sure it's cooked medium rare?" The manager's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time, he seemed to hesitate before responding. "Certainly," he said, but his voice now seemed a bit sharper. "I'll have that sent to the kitchen right away." He turned to leave, but as he did, he glanced over his shoulder once more. Something about the woman's presence made him uneasy, though he couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the way she was so composed, so calm, as if nothing in the world could shake her, or maybe it was the way she didn't seem to care about the small issues that had frustrated him. He didn't like feeling like this. The woman, still seated, felt the odd vibe between them, but she wasn't going to let it ruin her evening. She had already accepted that sometimes misunderstandings happened. She knew that the best way to handle these situations was with patience. Still, she couldn't help but notice the manager's lingering gaze and his tight-lipped expression. Something wasn't quite right. As the minutes passed, the situation seemed to simmer, and the woman couldn't shake the feeling that the manager had already judged her unfairly. She wasn't the kind of person who often encountered such attitudes, especially not in places like this. But she could feel it now, this invisible barrier between her and the staff. She hadn't done anything wrong, but somehow, it felt like she was being treated as if she were. The manager, who was now back at the host's stand, spoke to another employee in hushed tones. He kept casting quick, nervous glances in her direction, and before long, it became clear that he wasn't handling the situation the way he should have. Instead of simply apologizing or offering a better solution, he had allowed his frustration to cloud his judgment. And in doing so, he had made a decision that would soon lead to bigger consequences than he could have imagined. Unaware of the woman's true identity, the manager made a choice that he would soon regret. His growing sense of unease pushed him to take matters further than they needed to go. With a quick glance back at the woman's table, he turned toward the phone and made a decision that would change everything. He called the police. The manager felt a strange pressure building up in his chest. The moment he had made the call to the police, he could feel the weight of the decision. It wasn't something he had planned or even fully thought through. He just acted out of frustration, thinking he was handling an unruly customer. But now, as he stood at the phone, a tiny voice inside his head began to question whether he had gone too far. Still, the anger in his stomach told him it was too late to back out now. The phone call itself was short, but the words the manager used were precise. He spoke in a tone that seemed just a little too formal, as if trying to make the situation sound worse than it actually was. "Yes, I have a customer here causing a disruption," he said, his voice tight. "She's refusing to cooperate with the staff, and now she's asking for things that aren't available. I need someone to come and handle this." His words seemed final, like he was certain he was right, certain that the woman was somehow in the wrong. As he hung up the phone, he didn't realize how far this would go. The manager stood there for a moment, trying to collect himself. The phone call had been routine for him, nothing extraordinary. He had faced difficult situations before, and in his mind, this was just another one to solve. But as he glanced over toward the woman's table, he noticed that she was still sitting quietly, as if nothing had happened. Her calmness only seemed to irritate him further. Did she not see the seriousness of the situation? Meanwhile, the woman remained as composed as ever, not aware that the manager had already called the police. She was still waiting for her meal, trying to ignore the strange tension building in the room. She glanced at her watch and noticed that the minutes were ticking by slower than usual. She wondered if something else was going on, but she refused to let herself get worked up. She had dealt with far worse than this before. The atmosphere in the restaurant began to change. The staff, who had been busy attending to other customers, seemed to be watching the situation unfold from a distance. A few of the waiters exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the growing tension, but no one stepped forward to intervene. It was clear that the manager was the one running the show, and his decision had been made. From her seat, the woman could sense something was happening, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She had been in situations before where people had treated her differently, and while she didn't mind being left alone, she knew that something about her presence was making others nervous. It wasn't the first time, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, she felt the faintest stir of anxiety. What if this situation got worse? What if they really were going to call the police? But no matter what, she decided she wouldn't let it bother her. She had dealt with far more difficult situations before, and she wasn't going to let something so trivial ruin her evening. The restaurant continued to hum with activity, unaware that things were about to take a turn. The police were on their way, and neither the manager nor the woman knew what kind of consequences this decision would bring. The tension in the air grew thicker as the manager anxiously waited for the officers to arrive. Meanwhile, the woman remained calm, her patience undeterred, unaware of the unfolding drama just a few steps away. The woman continued to sit at her table, her eyes casually scanning the restaurant. The soft murmur of conversation around her and the clink of silverware provided a comforting background to her thoughts. She could sense the building tension in the air, but she didn't let it disturb her. She had been in far more stressful situations in her life, and this one, though slightly odd, didn't faze her. She had learned long ago that staying calm in moments like these was the key to maintaining control. However, she couldn't help but feel a nagging suspicion that something was going on behind the scenes. She had been waiting for her meal for some time, and the manager's behavior had grown increasingly strange. He had been acting a little too formal, a little too tense. His unease had started to become more obvious, and though he hadn't said anything out of line, there was an invisible shift in the atmosphere. Her instincts told her that something wasn't right, and she started to wonder if it was about her. It wasn't uncommon for people to react strangely when they saw someone like her, and she had dealt with it countless times before. Being a woman of power, success, and wealth often led to preconceived notions and judgments from others, many of which were based on nothing more than assumptions and stereotypes. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. The manager, his face now slightly flushed, walked toward her table with a purposeful stride. He stopped just short of her chair and stood there for a moment before speaking. "Ma'am, I've had to call the authorities. They'll be here shortly," he said, his voice tight. The words hung in the air between them, and for a brief second, she was taken aback. It wasn't the first time someone had involved the police in a situation that didn't require it, but hearing it directly made her pause. She looked up at him, her expression calm but piercing. "The police," she repeated softly, not yet reacting. She didn't raise her voice or sound defensive, but her question was clear. "What exactly are they being called for?" The manager looked uncomfortable. He shifted on his feet, glancing over his shoulder toward the staff and then back at her. "You've been difficult," he said, stumbling over his words. "The staff has tried to accommodate you, but it's just been one thing after another. I had no choice." The woman listened to him carefully, not interrupting. She could sense that his nerves were getting the better of him, but she couldn't understand why he would escalate the situation like this. She hadn't done anything wrong. She wasn't rude or demanding. She had simply asked for a dish that wasn't available, And when that happened, she asked for an alternative. That was all. But she had learned long ago that the truth didn't always matter to some people. Sometimes people acted on fear or ignorance. Sometimes they made decisions based on assumptions rather than facts. After a long silence, the woman smiled softly, her gaze unwavering. "I see," she said calmly. Her voice didn't betray any anger or frustration. Instead, there was a quiet authority in it that seemed to make the manager feel even more uneasy. "Well, I'm sure the police will be very interested to hear what's going on here." The manager didn't know how to respond. He had been sure that he was in control of the situation, but now he was second-guessing his actions. He had no idea who this woman was or what she could do. All he knew was that the decision to involve the police had been made in haste, and he was starting to realize that it might not be the best move. Meanwhile, the woman remained composed, though her mind was already working through the possibilities. She had a good idea of what was happening here. Someone had made assumptions about her based on how she looked, how she carried herself. And now, those assumptions were about to lead to a situation that neither she nor the restaurant staff could easily undo. The tension in the air was almost palpable as she waited for the police to arrive. She could feel the eyes of the staff on her, wondering how this was all going to play out. But she wasn't worried. She had been in far more challenging situations, and she was sure this one would resolve itself as well. What she didn't expect, however, was the shock that would come when her identity was revealed. The sound of the restaurant's front door opening caught the attention of everyone in the room. The atmosphere, which had been thick with tension for the last few minutes, seemed to freeze. People paused in mid-conversation, and even the waiters, who were rushing around, took a moment to glance toward the entrance. Two police officers, wearing their uniforms and carrying the calm authority of their roles, walked into the restaurant. The woman at the table didn't flinch. She had been through situations like this before, and she knew the drill. The officers, however, looked around briefly before their eyes landed on her. They weren't sure what they were walking into, but they could sense the unease in the air. The manager, standing just behind them, nervously cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Officers, thank you for coming," the manager said, his voice still holding that tight formal edge. He gestured toward the woman, still seated calmly at her table. "This is the customer I was telling you about. She's been causing a disruption, and we weren't sure how to handle it." The officers exchanged a quick glance. They had been called in for what seemed like a minor issue, but they could tell that there was more to the situation than what had been explained. The first officer, a woman with a professional but kind expression, approached the table, her eyes briefly studying the woman seated there. The woman simply smiled at her, her calm demeanor not changing. "Ma'am, I understand there's been some confusion," the officer said, her voice even but polite. "Can you tell me what happened?" The woman nodded slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I simply asked for a dish that wasn't available," she explained, her voice steady. "I was told that another option was out as well, so I ordered a steak instead. There was no issue at my end." The officer's gaze flickered to the manager, who was still standing nearby, watching anxiously. The second officer, a man, crossed his arms, still unsure about the situation. "So, there was no actual conflict, just a misunderstanding." The woman gave a small nod. "Exactly," she said. "There seems to have been some miscommunication. I've simply been waiting for my meal." The officer looked back at the manager, her expression softening. She could tell that this wasn't the kind of situation that required their involvement. It seemed like a simple misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion. The manager, who had been standing with a slight defensive posture, seemed to shrink under the weight of the conversation. "We were just trying to follow the rules," the manager explained hesitantly, his voice faltering. "But when the guest didn't seem to understand, we thought it was best to call for assistance." He trailed off, feeling the weight of his actions. The officers exchanged another look. The female officer turned her attention back to the woman. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, ma'am. It seems there's been a misunderstanding," she said with a slight nod. "If everything is in order, there's no reason for us to be here." The woman smiled politely. "I understand," she said, still composed. "I appreciate you coming, though. I'm sure the manager was only trying to resolve the situation in the best way he knew how." The officer smiled faintly and gave the manager one last glance. "It looks like everything is fine here, but I'll advise you to handle situations like this a bit more carefully next time," she said, her tone gentle yet firm. "We can't always be called for matters that don't need our attention." The manager nodded, now looking sheepish and regretful. The officers, satisfied that the situation was resolved, nodded at the woman and began to walk away. Before they left, the female officer turned back once more. "I hope you enjoy your meal, ma'am," she said kindly. As the officers made their way toward the door, the restaurant fell silent for a brief moment. The woman remained seated, her hands folded in front of her on the table, her gaze never leaving the manager. The air in the restaurant felt lighter, as if the weight of the tension had been lifted. The manager stood frozen, his mind racing. He had made a quick decision that seemed right in the moment, but now, standing here with the realization of what had just happened, he understood that he had misjudged the entire situation. It wasn't the first time someone had made a snap judgment based on appearance, but this time, the consequences felt much heavier. As the woman finally turned her attention back to her meal, her face betraying no signs of frustration or anger, the manager felt a deep sense of regret. He had no idea who she was, or the kind of life she led, but in that moment, it didn't matter. He had learned a harsh lesson, and he knew it would take more than just an apology to make up for what had just transpired. As the woman sat in the now quieter restaurant, she could feel the energy in the room shift. The police had left, and with them, the tension that had been thick in the air seemed to lift, though she knew that the situation had only just begun to unfold. She wasn't concerned about what had just happened. Her calm, graceful demeanor had ensured that nothing could rattle her, but she could tell that the manager and the rest of the staff were now on edge. They were unsure of what to expect, and that unease was evident in their hesitant glances and low murmurs. The woman took a moment to gather her thoughts. She wasn't angry, nor was she upset about the way the situation had played out. People often made assumptions, sometimes based on appearances or misunderstandings. She had been in enough high-profile situations to know that this kind of thing was not unusual. Still, she couldn't help but feel a little disappointed by how quickly the manager had chosen to act without fully understanding who she was. It was a reminder that not everyone took the time to look beyond the surface. She took a sip of water and looked around, feeling the eyes of the other diners on her. It was strange how quickly word could spread in a place like this. She knew that there was a chance the manager and staff might soon realize who she really was. They had no idea that the calm woman they had just treated with such suspicion was someone whose reputation carried weight in the business world, someone with more influence than they could imagine. As she sat quietly, the woman noticed the staff starting to move with more urgency. The manager, who had been standing at the back of the room, took a deep breath and began making his way toward her table. His steps were slow and careful, his posture more rigid than before. He didn't look at her directly, but his eyes kept flickering toward her. When he finally reached her table, he paused. There was an awkward silence between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The woman watched him, her expression unreadable. She could tell that he was uncomfortable. The previous sense of authority that he had carried with him earlier seemed to have faded, replaced by a sense of self-doubt. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened earlier," the manager said, his voice much softer now. He spoke as if he were carefully choosing his words. "I acted too quickly, and I misjudged the situation. I realize now that I should have handled things differently." The woman continued to watch him, her face calm, though her eyes were thoughtful. She had expected an apology at some point, but she hadn't expected it to be delivered like this. It wasn't about the apology itself, it was the way it came. There was a sincerity in his tone, but also a sense of vulnerability that made the moment feel genuine. "I understand," she said, her voice steady and kind. "It's easy to make assumptions when things seem unclear, but it's important to give people the benefit of the doubt. We're all human after all." The manager nodded, his face flushed with embarrassment. He wasn't used to apologizing in situations like this. Most of the time, when something went wrong in his restaurant, he could fix it quickly, usually with a few words and a gesture. But this situation had been different. He had misread it entirely, and now he could see the impact of his decision. "I hope you know that we take pride in our service here," he continued, still avoiding direct eye contact. "This isn't how we usually treat our guests. I'll make sure that this doesn't happen again." The woman smiled gently, her tone warm but firm. "I'm sure it won't. Sometimes it takes a mistake to learn something important. Just remember, the way we treat people says a lot about who we are." For a brief moment, their eyes met, and the manager felt a wave of relief wash over him. She wasn't angry. She wasn't seeking retribution. She had simply taken the opportunity to share a valuable lesson. It was a moment of clarity for him, one that he would likely reflect on for a long time. As the manager began to step away, the woman turned her attention back to her meal, her composure never faltering. She knew that the evening would soon return to normal, but she also knew that this experience had made an impression. It had reminded both her and the manager of something important, that assumptions and judgments could have serious consequences. But more than that, it had reminded them that it was never too late to learn and grow. The woman took another sip of her water, glancing around the room as the staff began to settle back into their routines. She didn't expect any special treatment, but she knew that the memory of this night would linger long after she left. And for the manager, this experience would likely change the way he approached situations like this in the future. As the minutes passed, the restaurant began to settle into its usual rhythm once again. The staff resumed their work, moving between tables with renewed focus. However, the tension that had once filled the air now seemed to linger in the background, though much quieter. The woman sat at her table, now enjoying her meal. Her calm demeanor never faltered, and she seemed completely at ease, as if the events of the past hour hadn't affected her at all. The manager, however, wasn't so composed. He had retreated to the back of the restaurant, his mind racing. His thoughts kept returning to the conversation with the woman, how easily he had misjudged her, and how much the situation had escalated without reason. He couldn't help but feel embarrassed, but more than that, he felt guilty. He had called the police, something he would likely regret for a long time. He knew he had made a mistake, but he didn't know how to fix it. There wasn't an easy way to undo the damage caused by his actions. He glanced over at the woman's table once more, and for the first time, he really looked at her. She wasn't just any guest. He had no idea who she was when he had made the call, but now, he was starting to realize just how foolish he had been. She sat there, calm and composed, her attention focused on her meal. There was an air of quiet authority about her, but it wasn't the kind of authority that demanded respect. It was the kind that naturally commanded attention, simply by being present. His thoughts were interrupted when one of the other waiters approached him. The young man, who had been working at the restaurant for some time, hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Do you know who she is?" The waiter asked softly, his eyes darting toward the woman at the table. The manager looked up, his brow furrowing. "Who?" he asked, not sure where the conversation was going. "The woman," the waiter said, leaning in slightly. "She's a billionaire, a big-name entrepreneur. I've seen her at business events, and I think she's the owner of several companies." The words hit the manager like a jolt of electricity. He felt his stomach drop as he realized just who he had called the police on. He had no idea that the woman sitting at his restaurant was one of the most successful and well-known people in the business world. His heart sank as the full weight of his mistake settled on him. I didn't know," the manager muttered, his voice almost lost. The waiter, looking sympathetic, just nodded. He didn't need to say anything more. The damage was already done. The manager turned and looked at the woman again, this time with a sense of awe. He had made a snap decision, acting on assumptions and his own frustration. But now he understood that she wasn't just another guest. She was someone who didn't need to prove anything, someone who had achieved more than most people could even imagine. And yet she had been treated like a troublemaker, simply because the manager had failed to recognize her. He knew he had to apologize again, but this time, the apology would need to be genuine. He had learned a hard lesson about assumptions, about judging people based on appearances, and about how easily things could spiral out of control. As the evening continued, the manager worked up the courage to approach her once again. He was still nervous, but this time, it was different. His earlier embarrassment had given way to a deeper sense of respect. He walked slowly to her table, pausing just a few steps away. The woman looked up as he approached, her expression calm and welcoming. There was no anger in her eyes, no sign of resentment. She had already moved on from the situation, but the manager felt as though he still needed to make things right. "Ma'am," he began, his voice steady but sincere, "I can't apologize enough for what happened earlier. I made a terrible mistake, and I can't undo it. I just want you to know that I am deeply sorry for how you were treated." The woman nodded, her gaze softening. "I appreciate your apology," she said, her voice gentle. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong. We all make mistakes." The manager, still feeling the weight of his actions, let out a small sigh of relief. The woman's kindness, her ability to forgive without hesitation, made him feel like there was hope for redemption. The words of her apology were enough to remind him that sometimes it was the smallest acts of grace that could turn a situation around. For a moment, the two of them simply stood there, each reflecting on the events that had unfolded. The manager, now fully aware of the importance of making thoughtful decisions, silently vowed to never again jump to conclusions or let his frustration cloud his judgment. The woman, for her part, had shown him a quiet but powerful lesson in patience, grace, and understanding. As the evening drew to a close, the restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The lights overhead softened, and the quiet hum of conversation filled the air once more. The woman had finished her meal, and though she could feel the lingering eyes of the staff, she remained unbothered. Her calm presence, once again, was a quiet reminder of how little she allowed external events to affect her. She had been through much more difficult situations in her life, and this was just another experience to learn from. Meanwhile, the manager lingered in the background, watching her from a distance. He hadn't left his post, though he had long since finished the task at hand. He found himself reflecting on the evening's events, replaying everything in his mind. The earlier tension, the phone call to the police, the look of quiet authority the woman had carried with her, all of it had shaken him. The embarrassment he felt was profound, and it weighed heavily on him. But there was also something else he couldn't quite shake: respect. He had underestimated her, and now he understood just how wrong he had been. She had never once raised her voice, never demanded anything more than what was fair. Instead, she had quietly observed, allowing the situation to unfold, waiting for the moment when the truth would inevitably come out. And when it did, she didn't seek retribution. She didn't lash out in anger or frustration. Instead, she offered grace, something the manager hadn't expected but would never forget. The hours passed, and the last of the guests finished their meals and began to trickle out. The woman remained seated at her table, her attention now focused on her phone, possibly responding to messages or emails. She didn't rush, allowing the moments to unfold naturally. It was clear to everyone in the room that she wasn't the type to let things get to her, no matter what. Finally, the manager worked up the courage to approach her one last time. This time, his steps were slower, more deliberate. He wanted to make sure that the words he had prepared would be sincere. He had learned his lesson, and he intended to express his gratitude, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely felt it. As he reached her table, the woman looked up at him. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes were warm, as if she knew exactly what he was about to say. The manager took a deep breath, standing there for a moment, trying to steady his nerves. "Ma'am," he began, his voice steady but tinged with humility, "I want to thank you for your patience and understanding tonight. You taught me something valuable about assumptions, about making quick judgments, and most importantly, about how we should treat others. I won't forget what happened here tonight." The woman gave him a small, reassuring smile. "We all make mistakes," she replied. "The important thing is how we learn from them. It's easy to judge based on the surface, but it's the deeper qualities that matter. You took responsibility, and that's something not everyone can do." The manager nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. She hadn't been looking for anything grand or special, just a simple acknowledgement. And he had given it to her, not because he felt guilty, but because he understood the deeper meaning behind her words. She had shown him that grace and kindness could be much more powerful than anger or retribution. "I'll do better," he said quietly. "I promise you that." The woman gave him a final smile, her eyes filled with understanding. "I believe you," she said gently. With that, she stood up, collecting her belongings and preparing to leave. The manager watched as she walked out of the restaurant, her presence lingering even after she had gone. For a brief moment, it felt as though the restaurant had been touched by something greater than just a simple dining experience. It wasn't about the meal or the setting. It was about the quiet power of how people treat one another, the lessons that could be learned in the most unexpected of circumstances. The manager watched her disappear into the night, a sense of respect deep in his heart. He knew that he would never forget the lessons she had imparted. The night had started with tension and uncertainty, but in the end, it had brought about a quiet understanding, a reminder that grace, patience, and humility could change the course of any situation. As the staff began to clean up and prepare for the next day, the manager's thoughts were clearer than they had been all evening. He had learned more than just how to handle a difficult situation. He had learned about the power of kindness, the importance of patience, and the deep impact that one person's presence could have on the world around them.